We are back for another sociology lesson, and this time we're going to dive deeper into what the concept of social facts is all about. We are going to look at the really convincing argument that Emil Durkheim offered the world about how the structure of society on the macro scale really affects life outcomes for people on the micro scale. So if our social structure is one way and we're familiar with that and we're comfortable with that and we know the maze of the social structure that we live in, we are usually comfortable navigating life based on that past experience. So what Emil Durkheim had is a very good opportunity to look in recent history. He published around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, and he had some recent historical data to look at that was focused on the change in human life expectancy, the change in our human life experience based on the way society was structured before the Industrial Revolution and the way society was structured after the Industrial Revolution. So, the Industrial Revolution, of course, is a period in Western history when people transitioned, the whole population really transitioned from an economic system based on agriculture to an economic system based on manufacturing. So the Industrial Revolution, we use the word revolution because it refers to massive change. And even though the Industrial Revolution took several decades, a century even, to really take hold, that's a short period of time when we're talking about human history. The majority of modern human history was focused on agricultural related jobs where just our two hands and very simple machines were available to us. Simple machines according to like the physics way, like wedges and rods and things like this, digging sticks and things like this, that we used our own hands for in order to produce our agricultural goods, whether it was plants or animal products. The whole world was really focused on our food supply and food production. So the social facts of social structure before the Industrial Revolution was that most people who participated in food production lived in small towns scattered around larger cities. Usually cities were on like a river or some kind of crossroads where transportation was easy to and from the big city. But in order to produce agricultural products, you had to have a lot of space, a lot of land. And so there were a whole bunch of small towns dotted all over the landscape. And every year when harvest time came for whatever it was that you in your small town produced, you would collect all the surplus that the town didn't need, that your family didn't need, and you'd travel into the big city and you'd go to market and you'd sell it to other people who had traveled there. And so the city was very well populated, but it had a lot of transient people in and out because the city was really there for a hub to trade your agricultural goods. And so people were not unfamiliar with big cities, but the big city was something that they went to and they came back to their very stable life in the small town where they originated. And it was very stable. I have the word generational stability on the board behind here describing what the social facts were like before the Industrial Revolution. You had generational stability in these small towns because you had family, generation after generation of the same family living in these small towns, probably occupying the same household, living on the same property, contributing to the farm work. Every member of the family had a significant role in making sure that the family's economy was successful and worked toward it. So children had a very significant role in the household. Women had a very significant role in the family economy, and certainly males had a very significant role in the family economy. And there was generational stability. Everybody had food to eat. Everybody had a job. We had a support network. And so there weren't a lot of social problems like you think of today in this modern society, where you have to pay high prices for food or pay high prices for rent or you don't own anything. There's not a whole lot of evidence in the historic record of people being so impoverished. For instance, poverty is considered to be a social problem. So there's not a whole lot of that because you had generations of people working together and a small town enough so that everybody was connected at some point to each other just from town history. So it was small enough to where maybe I am your best friend's grandmother and you don't know me personally and you're not necessarily friends with me personally, but you know who I am and at least that connection between our families of that friendship that our grandkids have. And so there were strong networks of people. And so the term social network is a term that is not new, and it doesn't mean anything tech field. At least it never used to in sociology. A tech social network is very different from the kind of social network we're talking about in the social structure prior to the Industrial Revolution. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, everybody was kind of, can I say everybody was in everybody's business? I mean, some of you maybe are from a small town right now and you kind of know what I'm talking about, that everybody kind of knows the connection that each other has to the small town and the small town's history and the, you know, the profession that your folks are in or your grandma or something. So that strong network, though, means that there's going to be a whole lot of stability and probably things like crime, which is seen as a social problem these days, a very common and increasing social problem these days. Crime didn't happen a whole lot in a small town that had this kind of social network, this kind of generational stability, because you kind of always had your conscience on your shoulder. You always knew that somebody, you know, you just wouldn't get away with it, right? You want to skip high school or something and you just won't get away with it because somebody will see you. You know, the librarian will see you going and they know your mom. They're going to call them right away, right? And so everybody had a job that was vital in the small town, and there were jobs like being a doctor or being a teacher or being a preacher or running the general store or something like that. There were jobs like that in small towns, of course, but the reason those jobs existed in those small towns, the reason the school was there, for instance, for the teacher to work in, was because there were so many families who were doing jobs directly related to agriculture. So even the teacher's job was directly related to agriculture because she was teaching the kids of the farmers and the ranchers who were producing the food that not only the town needed, but the nearby towns and everybody else who went to the city to buy it and take it miles and miles away to feed the population, right? And so before the Industrial Revolution, these close-knit towns, these generational stability, it really was a safety net for the elderly to be taken care of, for kids to not get into shenanigans and trouble and be delinquents, and for everybody to have enough food on the table. It didn't mean everybody was wealthy, but if you were doing better off than your neighbor, it was almost shameful not to help your neighbor out a little bit if they needed help. If their barn burned down, the whole, you know, county got together and helped them build a new one. If their cows were in the barn, God help us, and they were burned up when the barn burned down, probably somebody was willing to donate a calf to get you back up on your feet so that you could develop your herd again, right? These kinds of things that we see in old movies, old Western movies, were true about the way that society was structured in the olden days. No, there wasn't electricity. No, there wasn't air conditioning. Yes, it was manual labor. Yes, you got up when the sun came up. You went to bed pretty much when the candle burned out at night. It seems, I say it this way because so many of my students, at least in face-to-face classes, tell me, oh, that sounds so boring, or I don't like being outside. Well, you don't like being outside because you have an alternative. But back then, there really wasn't an alternative, and people didn't consider an alternative. But then comes the steam engine. Powered by coal or wood, the steam engine changed everything because It meant that you could automate manufacturing and you could change the social landscape. You could change the social facts of how most people lived, and you could change the need for so many hands and so much manual labor back on the farm. If you could invent a machine that would take the place of 5 or 6 men, it could do the work of 5 or 6 people, then it meant that agriculture was going to change. Like the way that we performed agriculture was going to change. People still had to eat, so agriculture still had to be done, but now machines could do it quicker, better, more efficiently, with better yield, all of these kinds of things. And so what happened was a massive change. That's what revolution means. A massive change in the way that we do work and where we do work. All of a sudden, machines took the place of the kid's job on the farm. It took the place of the hired hand's job on the farm. But a kid still needed to be able to make a living for the family, and a hired hand still needed to be able to make a living for his or her family. Where were they going to make a living? In the city, urbanization took place because you had to work in a factory in order to make those machines. So the cities that were the center of trade began to have factories built so that people would work in factories to make these machines that would make agriculture easier, and the massive change began to happen. Urbanization, this isation thing, a lot of English words have isation on the end of it. It means a process of becoming something. So cities couldn't just immediately accommodate everybody who moved there in order to try to get factory work. There weren't apartments, there weren't houses, there wasn't, a place for everybody to live or eat or sleep. There weren't sewers in order for everything to be taken away. And, cities were stinky, depressing places when you had a whole bunch of people flocking there to try to get a job at a factory. And so cities were being built, but often not built fast enough to accommodate the people who were coming from the countryside looking for work because the jobs had dried up out in the countryside. And so all of a sudden, instead of generational stability, where everybody would look out for each other and take care of each other as a community, all of a sudden, we have a whole bunch of people thrown together from Lord knows where. And since we are taught to be wary of strangers, you kind of kept to yourself as self-preservation and maybe not trusting too much of these people who you didn't have this reference. You were so used to having a reference of knowing whose family somebody came from and knowing what the old homestead looked like or something. You were so accustomed to having that reference, it was gone now because there were so many different people from all those different agricultural cities, all those different agricultural towns coming into the big city. And so there might be 70 times the population of people in the big city than there was in your original small town, but you've never felt more lonely because you don't know any of them. What do you have in common? You're a little scared to approach them. And life is hard in the big city. Crime, poverty, disease skyrockets. And Emil Durkheim observed this by looking at historic records. He looked at the records that were kept in small towns, and you didn't see arrest records. You had a one-room jailhouse, if there was a jailhouse at all. You didn't have a big police force. All of a sudden now, you have a whole lot of jobs created based on the fact that crime existed. And you had beat cops, and you had big jailhouses and this kind of thing. You had a whole lot of poverty. Soup kitchens became a thing, and vagrancy became something that was against the law, where you were hanging out on a street with no place to go. Well, homeless people don't have a place to go. Disease was rampant because there weren't sanitation systems. In urbanization, it's the process of building a city, and you need much more than just a roof over your head. You need clean water access, you need proper sanitation, all those kinds of things in order to not get sick. And so what happened was the abrupt change. Now, I said 100 years that the Industrial Revolution took place. Yes, but it takes a while to get used to all of this. And so when people who were used to this pattern were suddenly forced unwillingly to participate in this pattern of social facts, you had a whole lot of feelings of alienation from society. You had a whole lot of feelings of loneliness. You had weak or absent altogether communication, comradeship, family links, friendship in general. If you wrote home to the old folks at home, you didn't want to worry them, so you weren't going to say, oh, I'm doing terribly. I'm thinking of suicide because I feel so disconnected from everything. But one of the social problems that I did not put on the board here, let me do it now, that Emil Durkheim observed was that suicide rates, which were virtually non-existent in this social pattern. The records indicated that suicide was virtually non-existent over here, but all of a sudden suicide rates started to exist and skyrocketed in this kind of system over here. And so this is a terrible and unfortunate observation to make, but this was one of the first things that Emil Durkheim published, was his study of how the social facts before the Industrial Revolution and social facts after the Industrial Revolution, how it had a profound effect on life outcomes of individuals who had to negotiate these different social patterns. And so that's why the concept of social facts is so important, because if social facts are patterned ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that exist on the macro scale and trickle down and control us, or at least strongly influence, if you don't like the word control, at least strongly influence our behaviors, then those social facts can control the life outcomes. I use the word control again. Can bring about certain life outcomes that are not 100% under your power to make happen, because we inherit the macro scale pattern of social facts that exists at our birth, and we have to navigate that whether we like it or not. And so Emil Durkheim was successful in showing that the macro scale pattern of society is extremely important in affecting the life outcomes that we have as individuals. Okay, so text me with questions if you have them, and I'll see you next time.